along, everybody. Today we're going to talk about how the FOG we measure culture. For those of you who don't know, I'm seeing lots of lovely familiar faces. So good morning, it's nice to see you. I'm Paula Brockwell. I'm the lead psychologist at the Employee Experience Project, and you'll be glad to know that today I'm joined by the chief nerd of nerds within our team, Cara Daly, who was one of our business psychologists, and she'll be talking through things with you today as well. We'll be sharing different experiences and insights. In terms of what we're going to cover in the session today, I'll just kind of talk to you a little bit about this. So we very much are going to deep dive into the culture piece on this today, or sorry, on the measurement piece on this. But before we get there, we're just going to have a quick chat with you about really what culture is and what we define it as, because that really influences what we measure as we work along the way. So we'll talk to you a little bit about that. We'll explore this idea of getting beyond the surface, because certainly one of my biggest frustrations about culture measurement over the years, before I kind of decided I was staging a small revolution through our team on this stuff, is that so much of the research and the work and the modelling, the investigation that happens around culture is how do people feel and how are people acting, and it's pretty surface level actually. So we're going to talk to you a bit about how you burst through that so that your measurement can be truly meaningful and activating for you within your own organisation. We're going to talk a bit about personalising your benchmark. There's no keeping up with the Joneses here. We'll be talking very specifically about how you create something that's meaningful and useful for you. And then we're really going to dig into this piece around, well, what do you measure and when, and how do you measure it all? What we aren't going to do today is just like show you loads of items of a survey. I promise we're not going there, but we have built out the most ridiculous, I would suggest, the most ridiculous download that anyone has ever built on this. We have not shown it to our marketing consultant because she is going to lose her mind at how much stuff I think we're sharing around these sorts of things. But we've built that guide out for you, and you'll get a QR code to that today in the session, but we'll also email a link for you to download that tomorrow. So you'll get lots of pieces around specifically what sorts of things to say in focus groups or items that you might want to put into your surveys, etc., and access to all of our free tools and metrics to help you on the way on that. So quite a lot packed into the session today. We are so excited to have you here. I'm going to ask Cara to talk to you first of all about some of these first pieces around what culture is and how we get beyond the surface, and then we'll dig into our measurement framework in a bit. Okay, so Cara, I'm going to hand over to you if that's all right.
Lovely, thanks Paula. Yeah, Chief Nerd of Nerds reporting for duty. Lovely to be here with you all this morning. I like that name. I think I'm going to roll with it now. So just want to start by taking a few minutes just to do a little bit of, like Paula said, a bit of quick positioning at the beginning here, talking about what is culture, because actually before we start to measure culture, it's really helpful to define what it is that we're actually talking about and what it is that we're looking at measuring. Culture is it's a self-reinforcing cyclical system. It's driven by the ideas, the beliefs, the feelings, the customs, the processes, and the behaviours that you can see. These are all an expression of the culture, and it's this complex interdependent system, which I realise I'm making it sound very complicated, but ultimately it's how things get done in your business. It's how people act around here. It's how easy it is to get things done, and it's shaped by shared attitudes, behaviours, norms and assumptions that influence how people interact, how decisions get made, how people respond to change, and the experiences they have within that working environment. But it can feel so tricky to pin down because its inputs are also its outcomes. So the behaviours that you put into the system and into your culture are also the behaviours that you see as an output. But the reason we take a little bit of time to talk about culture and exactly what culture is and what we mean when we're talking about culture is because we so often see culture being described at the surface level of making people happy. And if we're only describing culture at that surface level, it's likely we're only going to measure it at the surface level as well. So by really building out that expectation of exactly what we mean by culture from the beginning, we're already starting to delve beyond the surface and think about those other things that we might need to measure when we're looking at understanding and measuring our culture. I'm going to have to be that person that says next slide, please, aren't I? Sorry, Paula. So So how do we go beyond that surface level? Quite a few of the common metrics for measuring culture tend to keep us in that place that I've talked about of culture being this thing that it is focused on making people happy. And so they don't take us much beyond that. They don't take us any deeper. They focus on measuring, what people are thinking, what they're feeling, what they believe, or what they're doing. And we see culture metrics like engagement surveys and ENPS as a way of exploring what current culture looks like. And they're not wrong. They're incredibly useful measurement tools, but they don't take us past that expression of colleague sentiment and colleague satisfaction. So we can build this picture of where people are happy, what they're happy with, and where they're dissatisfied. But it doesn't allow us to get under the surface to understand the what or the why of what's driving current culture. And we see the same with a lot of the tools and models that are out there as well, particularly from our perspective in the world of occupational and business psychology. That's given us some really credible tools for observing the current state. So we have, sorry, Paula, next slide, please. So we have tools like the OCI, the Organisational Culture Assessment Index. This is something that's still taught on business and occupational psychology masters. It's a validated research model. It was developed back in 1999, and it gives you an assessment of your culture across 4 cultural types. And it does a really good job of giving you those observable symptoms to explain your current culture. But again, it's not something that then helps us delve under the surface to explore what's actually driving your current culture. And in fact, to live up to my title of Chief Nerd of all nerds, most culture work has been focused on these models that define culture. There was a meta-analysis done back in 2022 that analysed 74 studies published across 68 journals on culture change over the last 20 years, and it concluded that the primary focus of all of these models that we have is for defining culture. And that's to the detriment of us being able to, get into understanding and evaluating the efficacy of any interventions that we then take to try and change and model it. And using these models can feel quite sticky because the world of work moves so quickly, and even models designed, five years ago won't be up to date with what's current now. And they just don't take us beyond understanding what current culture looks like to kind of truly understand our culture, what we want to change, how we need to change it, and what we need to focus on to drive those changes. So how do we get deeper to be able to take us beyond that surface level? So this lovely slide that you can see in front of you now, I'm absolutely obsessed with, because it's such a brilliant way of visualizing and understanding how we start to go deeper with understanding not only what our current culture is looking like, but why it looks like that and what's driving that. To go beyond that surface level expression, we need to understand what's driving colleagues' everyday experiences at work, what's driving their behaviours, and then the business results that creates. In its simplest form, we can break those drivers down into 2 core elements. We've got colleague expectation and we've got environmental stimuli, or how we do things around here and what we expect. So from the environment, we're looking at what conditions have we created for people to work in. That's things like the systems, the processes, the structures they're expected to operate within. And then the leadership actions, the behaviours, and the colleague and customer behaviours that are shaping that environment. And then the expectation. What do colleagues expect from their everyday experience? What filter do they have that they are analysing every experience through to work out whether they think it's acceptable and aligned to what they expect on a day-to-day basis? And once we know and understand those 2 different areas, and we've differentiated between the 2, we can then understand where we need to change the environment to better support colleagues to be happy, healthy, and connected to their work, and where we need to reset the expectation so people are aligned with the type of experience that's reasonable for them to expect, what's expected of them, what the business can offer in return, as well as understanding those things that are off the table, what the business can't offer. And then once we kind of understand that everyday experience, and we're then able to build a clearer picture of what our current culture looks like, we can then start to think about what do we want from the culture that we need. And this kind of goes back to what I've talked about briefly earlier with the off-the-shelf models, understanding what we need from our ideal culture. We can't benchmark this, and we don't want to benchmark this off of off-the-shelf models that have been developed a few years ago on an era of work that isn't realistic for where we are now, or they've been developed on the basis of data that's from businesses that have differing needs and context from your own business. Because like Paula said at the beginning, cultivating a great culture in your business isn't about keeping up with the Joneses. It's not about making sure that you have what everybody else has. It's about defining an ideal culture for your business that supports your business strategy and the drivers of colleague experience that you want to cultivate. So ultimately understanding your business drivers, what does your business need, what mindsets, what behaviours and what priorities are important for you as a business to be able to succeed. And then what does that mean for your talent? What does that mean for colleagues? How do you need to treat one another? How do you need to enable one another to be happy, healthy and connected enough to deliver? And having this base understanding, building up this base understanding of not only what your current culture looks like and how it's being driven by the environment and those expectations, but ultimately what your ideal culture needs to look like in terms of your business drivers and your talent drivers, is the key to being able to step beyond reacting to satisfaction, dissatisfaction and sentiment into shaping an environment where people really understand what's expected of them, they feel supported, and they're able to make a meaningful contribution to the business meeting its goals. Right, I've said a lot. I'm going to pause there, and I'm also going to hand over to Paula to take you into the next part of the session.
Lovely, thank you, Cara. Appreciate that, and I think this idea of bringing pragmatism to culture is really critical. If we want to be able to measure beyond sentiment, we want to get out of that place of really chasing, trying to make everyone happy in a world where actually we can't meet every single need. We have got pressure in some contexts to bring people back to the office, even though that isn't exactly what they want, etc. That capacity to build a meaningful deal and measure, are we working towards what the business needs to be productive, effective and sustainable, rather than this utopian rainbow-filled world that we're never going to be able to deliver. It makes the measurement much more meaningful, but it also makes it much more relevant to senior people, which then allows you to be able to create the stories, the data, the evidence that you need to gain the traction to drive this forward. So when we're talking about measuring culture, and when we built our measurement framework, I guess there's a few things that we're thinking about here. One is, what data do we need to be able to drive the change, to be able to understand what we need to change, where and how, but also what information do we need to be able to tell the story so that we can bring people with us on that journey, we can get them to be part of that change, and we can also get and keep permission to stay in that place, rather than be caught in a place where it's HR's job to do this stuff, and really all you need to measure is whether you're following your action plan or not, and you've got to send a quarterly report to board that says, yes, we said we build a competency framework and we have done, we said we do leadership training and we have done, because that stuff is critical, but it's not the only stuff. That's like building a wall without any mortar in it. You need the leadership piece, you need the teamwork to drive it through. So what we're sharing on the screen at the moment for you is our evaluation framework that we use for measuring culture. And there's 5 elements to it, but generally we break it down into 2 core pieces, depending on the stage that of the organisation that we're working with, really. For those who are in that place of trying to understand well, what type of culture do we have at the minute, and how fit for purpose is that? So we really do cultural alignment reviews, understand what ideal looks like, and then help you get a sense of whether your current culture is in service to the types of behaviour and the type of performance that the business wants to drive forward, and if it's in service, as Cara said, to those talent drivers, to allowing us to create an environment where the type of people that we need to be able to deliver what we do will come, be excited, they'll flourish, they'll stay, they'll do a great job. So when it comes to kind of looking through this, there's a few things that we encourage you to do. In that place of kind of cultural audit or alignment review, I think often what we do is focus just on the first area, that piece around current state evaluation, which is massively critical. But really, what we see a lot of organisations do really effectively is they describe the centre one, experience absolutely and totally. This is how people feel and this is how people are behaving. And what we get then whenever we've measured that is we get this real hit of connection, agreement. People can absolutely see that that's exactly what it's like around here. That's exactly what the problems are. And those are exactly the behaviours and attitudes that people are demonstrating that we don't want around here anymore. So we get this list of fixes that people really identify with. But then there's this kind of intake of breath, because people are like, well, yeah, okay, so we know that, but what do we actually do now? So in understanding the current state, we need to understand those experiences, but it's worth doing that broader piece of storytelling when we're measuring, and make sure that we're capturing that piece around expectation as well, and we're understanding some outcomes. And I'll share some stuff with you in a minute about how you can start to measure that and understand it. We also need to, or what we would suggest anyway, if you want to drink from our particular flavour of Kool-Aid on this, is it's helpful then to do that so what factor. There's two things that we really need to do. One is about understanding the ideal. So what is it that we want it to be like around here? What is it that we need it to be like around here in order to drive that business context? And what we can then start to do is that gap analysis, that alignment review of understanding, well, how different is where we are at the moment for where we want to be. And in doing that piece of gap analysis, not only do we want to understand what's missing in terms of behaviour and approach and what's the stuff that's annoying everybody, which I think we can access really well, we also want to dig into what's really driving that. So yes, we look at the observable behaviour of colleagues don't take enough personal responsibility, or people aren't innovative enough, they're not risky enough, they're not willing to speak up, whatever the behaviour might be. We describe that well, but we've got to make sure that we're accessing and measuring what's driving that. What is other people's behaviour doing that is influencing that? What are the beliefs that those people are bringing into a situation that is driving that? What in our systems and our processes is encouraging that behaviour to happen because it's flourishing, because it's able to? And what is it about our structure as well that might be influencing that? So looking more broadly than the behaviour to the drivers that drive that through is important. And I'm going to share how you do that in a minute. And then the other sections that we're going to talk to you about today is that, again, I think sometimes we see clients who get really stuck in just measuring that current state and then moving straight to looking at the first point of the action element. So what they do is they build an action plan, and then they're reporting on their measurement, on their culture change programs or efforts, or even just culture cultivation work, is about, have we completed the action plan? So did we do the competency framework? Tick. Have we done the leadership training? Tick. But what we don't necessarily think about is checking the quality of that plan, and are those elements aligned? But also, we're certainly not looking at kind of cross ownership. What is leadership doing around driving their role? Are we measuring their delivery on the action plan and taking account for that? Are we looking at the impact of those actions in terms of fostering readiness and moving things forward for us? Is that action actually useful, and is it being shared in the right places? And we never really get to the point of truly measuring the outcomes in a useful way. And we're going to introduce the idea to you today of kind of lead and lag indicators, which is not expecting that we'll suddenly see this magical flip of culture and behavioural transformation, but setting ourselves up in our evaluation to make sure that in the early stages, we're measuring the stuff that is realistic to be popping up in the early stages. So are we seeing the green shoots, and what do those need to look like for us? And are we measuring to to make sure those are coming. And then over time, we're evolving that measurement framework to make sure that we're picking the full blooms as they start to build. But recognizing that when we're in the planting stage, seed stage, and the watering the garden stage, we're probably not going to see full blooms popping up everywhere. That's not how it's created. So this allows us to really start to apply the right measurement insight at the right time, and it encourages us to broaden from that kind of that disarming comfort that we get that we've nailed this because we're describing exactly what's going on, but then that gut-wrenching feeling of, yeah, but we still don't know what to do about it. We've described it perfectly, but what the hell do we actually do? So we're going to talk about those elements and help you think about that as we go. So before I move on, we love this stuff. Anybody got any questions, observations that you want to ask at this stage, or shall we move on and delve into the detail a bit? Anything anybody wants to share? Scanning to see. Yeah, Anika, go ahead.
Hi, Paula. Lovely
Hiya.
to see you.
you.
I just wanted to say I love this model, and we've been following it broadly. So I'm now at the stage of figuring out the action plan, and we've pulled together an action plan, but it's really lovely to hear and I need to remind myself, or I'm looking forward to hearing about the lag and the lead indicators, because I'm now at the stage of, well, how do we measure success? And I think there's a real temptation by the organization to just go, well, it's not doing anything yet, so it can't be the right stuff that we're doing, so let's change everything and throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I'm keen for that not to happen, and to really, gently encourage people, with all OD and culture work, it takes time, right? So get the organization or the leadership particularly to understand that, that difference between the green shoots and the full bloom bit. I like that analogy. So thank you.
Yeah. Great, you're welcome. And I think you're so right. It's a really tricky period, isn't it? I think often when we work so hard in the early stages to catch leadership's attention that culture is important, and then we say we're going to do this stuff, but it's going to take a minute for us to see things. So this idea of being really clear about, well, what are the lead indicators that tell us that stuff is moving, so that we may not be able to say that everybody's suddenly going to speak up and give us their most innovative ideas in meetings tomorrow, but where are we noticing progress and what's telling us that we're on the right track? That's the stuff that's important. I'm sure that Cara could give us a huge number of analogies from her life many years ago of being a personal trainer. You don't suddenly turn up bodybuilder of the century because you've been to the gym 3 times, but if you shift your eating and you shift your exercise pattern, you probably notice your energy starting to shift quite quickly on things, or you notice that that you feel kind of more positive about yourself because you're taking control on things. So you may not have that full body transformation on things yet, but if you keep doing that stuff and you celebrate the progress that you're making and notice the benefits that are coming, then actually you're able to build and keep that motivation to keep moving through. I'm giving you flashback, Cara, to just keep going, you'll get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I needed to start talking about lead and lag indicators to my clients. Maybe I was missing the trick there.
That might be our next white paper, is it? Take the PT industry by storm on this. Okay, so let's talk first of all about this idea of current state then, and really what we want to measure and be thinking about within this. So as I mentioned, I think a lot of the time I'm just sharing with you some of the metrics that we use on this, and you'll find in the white paper that there's either access to dip test free tools around this stuff, or we've given you some examples of different ways that you can measure and report on this through there as well. As I said, don't tell our marketing consultant about that because I'll be in trouble, but I think if we're going to do this, we've got to do it right in terms of supporting you to move this stuff forward. So that piece around the observed experiences and norms, I am not trying to poo-poo that at all. It is an important piece to pick up. We've got to understand what it feels like around here and how people are behaving. We've got to understand that from a storytelling point of view, but also to tell us whether it's functional or aligns with what we actually need to move forward. I think the challenge comes whenever we stop at that point and we don't measure anything else, because what we end up doing then is inferring generally. We end up in, as Cara talked about, that sentiment trap of going, oh, people aren't happy, or people people aren't taking responsibility. So what we need to do then is train them on decision making. So people don't take personal responsibility for decisions. So we need to train them on some decision making models. So we take quite a symptomatic approach to it. It's, you know, I've got a sore arm, I'll put a bandage on my arm without thinking, oh, well, I've been carrying heavy shopping, or I lie in a weird way, which means all we've really got is a bandage and an arm that's still sore on things. So recognizing that stuff is important because it tells us what we need to shift, but what it doesn't do is tell us how we need to shift it. So there's two things that are really helpful to measure to allow us to look at that, which relate exactly back to the graphic that Cara talked about earlier. Those externalized, the expectations and internalized beliefs. So basically those psychological contract or the expectations is critical. And we simplify this down. The deals are really complex that people have. It's basically the stuff that they hold in their heads that they believe has been promised to them or is owed to them from all of their experiences with the business, but also that they bring from other experiences through life. And when we don't actively curate that psychological contract with our people, they create something that fits with them. And I think we're in an interesting time post-pandemic because site contract was really shaken up in that time, that introduction of remote working, the very people-centric mode that all of us went into. Do you remember when it used to be nice to each other and people didn't, people used local businesses and, did more recycling and things like that. But there was a shift in behaviour, the way that businesses treated their people. Even the most cutthroat business-centric businesses started most conversations with, how are you? Are you doing okay? I was listening to a podcast with the former Prime Minister from New Zealand last week, and she was reflecting on COVID and how international leaders don't know each other at all on a personal level, but in that period everybody had that first 10-minute call of how are you. So it was a fundamental shift in the way that we engaged with each other and the way that work worked, which means that a lot of us are carrying the echoes of this really high expectation of how businesses prioritize colleague experience and colleague needs, which might be a bit out of balance. But understanding, so it is complex and it is multifaceted, but sometimes actually just understanding what is it that people understand that is reasonable for the business to need and expect from them, and what is it that at its most base that people think is reasonable for the business to give them. If we just understand those two things, we can get a sense of, well, is our deal balanced? Is it reasonable? Is it something that we can actually deliver? Or is there some work that we need to do to reset that in a way that's helpful for moving forward? Sometimes it's just that the deal's got a bit out of date. It was perfectly functional for our point in time, but the market's changed, we're growing, our ambition has shifted, and suddenly what people thought we were isn't what we are anymore, but it's subtly shifted because our emphasis is driving. So asking yourself those key questions of what do people believe they should get, and what is it they believe they should give, and is that reasonable, is a really helpful piece of additional data and analysis to be doing as you measure culture. And the other piece, which genuinely was a game changer for me on a professional level, and playing with the smoke around this, is really targeting and measuring the environmental nudges and drivers in a structured way. So I am sure I am not alone in saying that I would often have really difficult conversations with leadership teams in particular, where understanding what the expressed culture was and what the observed culture was and what was driving it was really clear in my head. It was kind of a bit all over the place, but it was really clear. I could see that the reason that people didn't want to take personal responsibility was because the leadership team were a bit controlling and sometimes got a bit penaltive about things. The systems and processes, etc., weren't quite right. But whenever I started to pull at that thread, I'd find that the conversation would go all over the place, because someone would go, well, maybe that, but they do this and they do that, etc. So it became really difficult to have a conversation about the whole system in one place. So one of the bits of work that I did very early on when deciding to find the employee experience project was say, you know what, we are going to get these drivers on one page, because all of those things can be true, but one cannot distract from another. So this tool is really about helping you look at your whole organizational ecosystem and say, but what across these areas, which of these is really helping or hindering us on driving things forward? What is happening within these different areas? So this tool is about really helping you to understand and drive that forward and be able to to kind of consider and see them in one place, which means absolutely we can have a conversation about colleagues' clarity of expectations, but that doesn't change the fact that role modelling or empowerment from leadership is not where it needs to be. So both of those things need to be worked on, not that we just need to have a conversation about this one thing. So creating some sort of dashboard, some sort of structure that's helping you really understand this will be helpful. And I'll show you some of the tools that we're going to share with you around these areas in a minute, but we've given you some guidance on this in terms of what types of areas do you need to investigate, how do you codify that, and how do you start to dashboard that, because you can share that. And this is a really great tool as well for some of that green shooting later on down the line, where if you evaluate this and dashboard it up, then you're able over time to show how the dashboard is changing. So the outcomes might have come yet, but we've made some big strides on our management behaviour around operational planning, or the consistency of experience that we're getting across different business areas. We're able to show where we're moving things from red to amber to green, and that we are having progress and impact. So I've mentioned already the different purpose of these different things, but just to kind of share with you the access to the different tools that you'll get around this. So there, as Cara said, all of the research around culture has focused on this idea of describing experienced culture. It's shameful, really. As a psychologist, I feel a bit mad at us for all of the missed opportunity and the ridiculous, 70 odd studies, I think you said, didn't you, in that meta-analysis, 70 points that people have just remarked and created each other's, recreated each other's work on this sort of thing to create a slightly different model. We've done the same, I'm not going to lie, this works for us. So we have created our own model, but I guess that's my slightly clunky way of saying, how you measure your current culture kind of doesn't matter as long as you're measuring the other stuff as well. I would say that we've got a free tool on this. It takes about 10 minutes to complete, that I'll give you the QR code at the end. What we've tried to do, though, is make sure that in using this model, we've aimed not just to describe the culture, but link that then to that kind of grade of not just how are people feeling and how are they behaving, but what does that mean in terms of how it shows up for the business and the impact that's having for the business. So have a look at the tool and have a play with it, because I think a lot of the tools just do that bit around we're too autocratic, or we're not empowering enough, and then we leave leaders with these big fluffy words. They're going, okay, well, what does that mean, and how does that show up in practicality, and what does that actually mean in terms of how people feel or what they believe they're allowed to do? So what we've tried to do with our metric is link that story together, so it makes it easier for you to tell that story. So I'd really encourage you, if you're thinking about this area and you're thinking about measuring this, consider the story that you're telling, how you link those 4 circles together. So yes, how do we behave, or what does our system look like? How do we behave? But what does that mean in terms of what people are experiencing, and therefore what they believe about how they should behave, and therefore what behaviour are we getting and what outcomes is that driving? So have a play with this tool, and that'll let you have a look at that. That'll let you have a look at that. The other thing I'd say about that, not that I'm obsessed with it or anything, but I am, it does take literally 10 minutes to complete, and when you complete it, you get a personalised report. So if you have some execs who are interested in this stuff, but you're struggling to shift the conversation, getting them to complete this tool and then just having a conversation with them about the results can be a really good way to start the conversation about measuring culture and moving things forward. So something to play with. We'll also, in the white paper, share this matrix with you and share with you some ways that you can start to think about that balance and whereabout you might sit on this grid around things. So again, this is a really critical element to understand, because a number of the projects that we're working on at the minute, we're not actually, well, we're doing a little bit of environmental shifting work, but a lot of what we're doing is actually storytelling, so deal reset. So there's a number of businesses that we're working with that have either been acquired by another business or they've shifted their growth trajectory, so that the core principles and values of the business haven't changed, but the emphasis of what the business needs to do is a little bit different. And so we're working with them to help them articulate that new psychological contract in the context of moving things forward. So you might be in that situation that actually it's not that everything is terrible, it's that people's expectations of what you give are not in the right place or not reasonable to what you can offer at the moment, and you need to do that work, that storytelling, that recontracting to move things forward. So just remember that you don't have to fix everything all the time. Sometimes it's just about helping people see it in a different lens, and this will help you look at it in that way. And then, as I mentioned, CCSQ will give you access to a download on that, which gives you an indication of the evaluative criteria. But you can see here where you get that real opportunity to evaluate and benchmark on not just one or two things that you start to fight about the veracity of because it's caught somebody's defences or the like. You can step back and say, yes, that and all of these things, and we need to work on this. So what it allows you to do, and I think this is where its power is I always want to be, I never want to be in a tennis match when it comes to culture. I'm not interested in having a conversation with someone where we're bouncing a point back and forth to try and prove it to each other. My role, our role as culture activators within our business is to stand beside our leadership team and look at that information together and say, how do we understand this and how do we solve this together? And this really helps it. It allows you to focus the conversation as a joint thing that we need to work on together rather than a point that I need to land with you on that. And we give you guidance on the red, amber, greening and the types of criteria, etc., to use to work through. But generally, you know, if you're what's really interesting is that, again, some of the clients that we work with, they've done their own culture audit and they've got to that point of, we know what's going on, but we don't know what to do with it. And they'll ask us to come in to help them with that priority setting and action planning piece moving forward. And often we don't actually need to collect any more data. We're just looking through the lens of the information and insights that have already been given. We comb through the focus groups, we look at the surveys, etc. And we just reorganize the information that's already at your fingertips to help you be able to see what it's driving around these areas. So this isn't about adding lots of different stages. It's probably about asking, maybe in an ideal world, one or two slightly different questions in your listening circles or focus groups, but then filtering that information in a useful way through. Okay, so lots of things there that help you to be able to do that piece around current, ideal and gap analysis. And as I mentioned, we're giving you a shed load of resources that focus very specifically on each of those sections, including ideal questions for focus groups, looking at current and ideal culture, survey questions, etc., that you can use, and then the evaluative criteria that allows you to pull this analysis out on the other side. So I'm going to take a breath actually before I take you into this bit because I got a bit excited there, didn't I? Any questions, observations, anything anybody wants to talk about on that before we get into the outcome piece? Yeah, all good. On silence, my favorite. Okay, joking. Okay, so let's start to talk then about kind of the fourth element of the fourth and fifth element of the model, which is this piece around evaluating progress or evaluating whether you're on track. So you don't have to use these measurements in a full transformation. You know, we work with some businesses where culture is just something that they're working on all the time, and that's the gold standard, isn't it? That's where we want to get to. It's not something that we just do and it's fixed. It's a bit like a soup on a stove with a high heat. If we don't keep stirring and adding ingredients and moving things around, then it's going to overboil. So Cara's going to deep dive into this section a bit more with you, but I just want to give you some context on this. So often when we start working with businesses, they're focusing their evaluation around this plate. So we've got an action plan and we're ticking off that action plan as we go. And that is important. We've got to make sure that some stuff is happening and that stuff is actually happening. But typically that evaluation is more about our HR doing the things that they need to do. I know I've said that loads, but it's a real bugbear of mine. So there's a few things that we can do to move forward when it comes to evaluation in the action planning stage. The first is to break out action from outcome. And the second is then to make sure in our outcomes, we're thinking about this idea of what's the stuff that we should be able to see pretty quickly from a lead indicator point of view, and what's the stuff that might take us a little bit longer to see, but we will know what it is when it's coming. So I'm not going to labour the point on the action planning piece. All I would say to you is that action focused progress review is helpful as long as you don't accidentally put yourself in a box. It's not just the HR action plan. It should be multi-streamed. It should be multifunctional. It should absolutely assume that leadership have a core role of making culture feel real, relevant and safe in the organisation. So there should be actions for leaders to be doing that, and you should be giving yourself the opportunity to hold them accountable for whether they're taking those actions as well as whether the outcome's running through. And the other thing that I would say about the action piece is looking at those, you end up in a world of work streams. If you do that cross-functional piece, that whole system action plan, it's too big to have in one sheet. So normally you'll have some work streams going on, and you've got to make sure that those work streams are actually aligning to each other. So the comms team isn't talking about, isn't talking about innovation when really you're at a point of just trying to make people feel a bit safe to give a little bit of feedback as a starting point, to be able to talk openly and honestly about what they don't like. There's a journey of behaviours that you need to take through. So making sure that those are aligned and pointing in the same direction is helpful. So really thinking about how you set your action plan up, not to force yourself into that corner of being the owner of culture and the ticking off of all of the actions without having the glue that's going to bring those actions to life is really important. But Cara's going to focus a bit more specifically, I think, on the outcome piece, because I imagine that's a really helpful place to explore. Hand over to you, Cara.
Thanks, Paula. So one of the clearest signals for culture change isn't what people are saying, it's what people are doing. Changes to culture become really visible for us through things like people's everyday choices, the ease of or friction within delivery, the quality of collaboration, how confidently people take ownership of their work. And over time, those patterns will create the results that your business is delivering. But the crucial kind of framing to have here and thing to have in your mind and be aware of is that change takes time. But the impact of taking action to drive new behaviours, behaviours that are systemic and that are sustained, can drag behind and lag behind those initial efforts to start reshaping the expectations, to building capability and to redesigning enablers. And if we start to focus, like Paula already alluded to earlier, if we start to focus too early on trying to track those final outcomes, we risk putting ourselves in a position where we are forcing superficial quick wins, which might take hold momentarily, but they're not going to embed into that fundamental systemic change that we're looking to drive. Or we risk being in a position where we're completely misjudging any kind of meaningful progress altogether. So how do we stop ourselves from letting that happen? And one of the key ways of doing that is looking to differentiate between those lead and lag indicators in our tracking, because together both of them will help us to track the conditions that are being built, but also the results that follow from that. So if we start with lead indicators, so these are the things that are going to help you assess if the systems are being reshaped to support the right behaviours. And they're really, really useful when you're in those early stages of building the foundations of progress. So we tend to group lead indicators into two categories. You've got system evolution, and then you've got readiness to change. So system evolution looks to explore whether the organisational environment is supporting or blocking the culture that you're trying to build. And this is where you can really look at the CCSQ that Paul has talked you through earlier. This can be such a useful tool for you, where you've already RAG rated, and you can then start to look at and focus and explore leadership role modelling, leadership empowerment as some of those kind of key early kind of lead indicators into how the system is being reshaped. And you might look at indicators that include things like enablement. Are those systems, those structures and those workflows helping people to behave differently? Are they encouraging those new or shifted behaviours that you're looking to drive? What about psychological safety? Are those changes driving a space and a system where people feel safe to speak up, to test new approaches and to admit mistakes? Visible impact's a really important one here as well. There's a storytelling piece to embedding culture change that is so helpful for getting people to understand not only the need for change and their part in the change, but how their actions are helping to shift the culture and deliver better outcomes. And also those leadership signals that I mentioned a moment ago. How are leaders acting and behaving? How are they modelling change? How are they removing barriers to ensure that those new behaviours can embed? And like I said, utilise your CCSQ here, look back at those core drivers and map there to explore the evolution of progress. And then the second point here is that it's so key to focus on is readiness to change. Paula, if you can jump to the next slide, please. So readiness to change, this explores how well people understand, accept and feel able to play their role in culture change. So you might look to kind of focus across these 4 areas, starting with awareness, and that goes back to the storytelling I mentioned a moment ago. It's ensuring that you are telling the story and communicating to colleagues in a way that enables them to understand the need for the change, buy into that need, but crucially recognising what is expected of them, that understanding that culture change is a team sport and an awareness that they have a role to play in that. You might also want to look here and explore at mindset. So do they understand that they have a role to play in this? Do they understand what that role looks like? And then capability. Are your colleagues confident that they have the tools and the skills that they need to be able to exhibit those new behaviours? And that's going to be looking at the systems, the tools and the processes that you're shaping to encourage those behavioural outputs. And finally, the opportunity. Are there moments where people can try out the new ways of working? If you are looking to drive, greater accountability and decision making at lower levels of the organisation, are leadership and management shaping those systems and behaviours that are going to facilitate that? Are those opportunities there? All of these measurements across those 4 areas will provide insight for you into whether culture change is being enabled systematically across the business. And like I said, you can use the benchmarking of your culture drivers in your CCSQ to really map progress around the behavioural elements or any areas of blocking effectively. And that just helps you to start to test, check, adjust, shift and reshape where you need to. So if we move then on to looking at lag indicators. So these are really valuable tools for helping you to evaluate that longer term progress. These are the tools that will really help you to assess whether the behaviours that you're working to embed are delivering results across teams, across customer experience and across wider business performance. But like I said before, it's essential that we avoid relying on these lag indicators too early. Because if pressure builds to prove success through the business metrics before the system's truly shifted, you risk to default into those kind of short-term fixes that are going to ultimately undermine the longer-term changes. These outcomes are going to take time to emerge because culture takes time to embed. It requires that constant remodeling, reinforcement and recalibration of the whole system, that those lead indicators are going to help you to track and see, so you can shift and adjust where you need to. So thinking about your lag indicators, they are Sorry, I think we might have lost. Oh no, slides about Deborah. I wasn't sure if we lost. I had a moment of panic then that we lost Paula. I'll carry on chatting anyway. So lag indicators are best used as those validating signals for you that your early investment has paid off. That reshaping that you've done is paying off, and that your culture is staying on a productive track. And behaviours are arguably the most important lag indicator that you can look to track here, because those behaviours that your culture mapping has identified as critical to your strategic goals are the behaviours that you want to be looking to track with these lag indicators. And the key here is aligning what you measure with the behaviours you're trying to activate, and sequencing your measurement with your kind of action planning that Paul has talked about, and your business priorities and strategic priorities. So it's about being intentional rather than looking to measure every possible conceivable behaviour. So start with those behavioural priorities within your action planning. So, what are 2 or 3 key behavioural shifts that you're trying to embed this year, for argument's sake? And then define what good looks like for each. What will people be doing? What will people be saying if that behaviour is thriving? And by linking that mapping to your your roadmap and your action plan, you're ensuring that what you're measuring is valid and useful. At this stage, it's helpful to avoid things like self-report measures on ideal behaviours. We'd encourage and suggest, and we do ourselves in our practice, to look at live observations or behaviour-based survey questions that focus on the observed behaviours in others. You can use things like focus groups and colleague storytelling, but you can also use your concrete people data here, so performance reviews, grievances, recognition scheme submissions, or even exit interview trends. And here you can really utilise your people and your business metrics as well. They're a really powerful tool in measuring your lag indicators. Your business outcomes are going to make the most sense if you're interpreting them in the context of your cultural intent, so the ideal culture that you're working towards achieving and embedding. So the question is more about, is performance or engagement up or down? Instead, it's about, are those cultural shifts you've prioritised helping you in moving towards broader organisational goals? And are the patterns of behaviour you're enabling helping you to deliver the results that you're seeking? And some key outcome indicators here can include things like, attrition data, particularly, early turnover of new hires who are aligned to the ideal culture. Inclusion and retention metrics, but will give you an insight into how the culture is being experienced. Things like, customer outcomes, satisfaction levels, complaint resolution trends, leadership load and focus, so shift in decision making and accountability distribution, and overall business performance, reflecting progress against those strategic priorities. All of these measures will help you to track whether culture change is translating into that meaningful system-wide impact. And they can also help you to adapt your culture change program, recalibrating where needed, but also sustaining momentum when you've hit the right track. And then next slide, please, Paula. Thank you. So thinking about how we then, how we map that, how we utilise, scorecard development and trend mapping, so that we can effectively not only map this ourselves, but share it with all internal invested stakeholders. I'm sure it's not going to come as any surprise for me to say that there isn't a one-size-fits-all culture measurement scorecard. Like, what you track and when will be specific to the context and the cultural goals of your business. But there are some guiding principles to use when developing your own personal, measurement dashboard. There isn't a single measure that will give you everything you need. So develop your measurement framework to include both those lead and lag indicators. That's what will give you kind of actionable insights across your cultural progress. So start by thinking about that initial activation stages, and that's where you're going to see more of those lead indicators that are your focus. There'll be a bit of overlap, but then as momentum grows, that's when you'll be starting to look to bring in some of those lag indicators, so you can really see and explore and understand how things are embedding and where they aren't, and where you need to make those shifts and those tweaks. So really think about planning to measure over time, what you need to measure and when, as well as the reporting structures that you will be looking to include here to support ongoing progress review, reprioritization, and action planning refresh. So think about what it would be useful, what kind of dashboard it would be useful for you to develop, to not only have in front of you within HR, but also what you can then put in front of your exec team. Because if we're looking at leadership modelling and enablement as being really key to that initial activation stage and part of those lead indicators, what can you dashboard and put in front of your exec that gives them visibility to that localized leadership enablement, across departments, teams, who is having those initial conversations with their teams, who is starting to model those behaviours and create the conditions for those new behaviours to embed, where isn't that lifting as much, and that just starts to give you actionable insights. And within that as well, think about an agreement of cadence for executive review, accountability on progress. What are your in-project reporting structures going to look like? Is there an agreement there that needs to happen around reporting and oversight priorities with the board, and what's their involvement going to be in that, in terms of ensuring supported, targeted, helpful oversight? Okay, keeping half an eye on time. I'm going to take a pause there because we've thrown a lot at you. We've got a few minutes left for any questions that you might have. We will also flip on to the available resources. We've talked a lot throughout the session about the guide that we've produced, our EX Index, our Culture Catalyst scorecard, and also the Change Readiness Index. So I'll leave this slide up while there might be any questions. Feel free to use the QR codes to access. You will also get an email from us tomorrow morning, which will include a link to the recording of the session. It will also include a link to download the guide, which has QR codes that will allow you to access all of these resources as well. Right. I'm going to take a breath now and see if there's any questions from anyone.
So, any thoughts, comments, observations at this stage, or have we filled people's brains enough to let you go and sit in a dark room for a bit? We're straight into the next Teams meeting, let's be honest. Well, I suppose all there is for us to say is thank you so much for your time today. We hope that the session feels useful. Shed a load of stuff coming your way if it's useful, or you use as feels helpful for you. If anything has kind of caught with you, or you're thinking, yes, but not in my context, or not quite this, and you just want a quick chat, please feel free to just get in touch. The emails confirming everything come straight into my inbox. So give us a shout and get in touch, and we'll be happy to have a chat to help you move forward if that's useful. Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for your time.